before the new atheist phenomenon has kind of erupted proper, but it's well into a decade when Richard Dawkins and a few others are articulating with great force and great cogency their theory of science and religion being completely incompatible.
So it's my pleasure to be here on behalf of the ISSR Book Prize panel to say how pleased we were to give a prize to Nick Spencer in 2024 for Magisteria, the entangled histories of science and religion. It's the best historical survey of science and religion to have been published for a long time. And the judges had no hesitation at all in choosing this book as one of the 2024 prize winners. Entangled is a good word in the title, and I think it conveys something of the complexity of the relationship between science and religion. It's very tempting to go into sort of oversimplifications of the relationship between them, something sort of veering towards the send up of English history in 1066 and all that, with sort of goodies and baddies. One of the things we liked about this book is that it really engages with the complexity of the relationship between science and religion. And that means you have to go into detail. And there's a huge amount of detail in this book. And it's a tribute to any author to be on top of the amount of detail that there is here over a very long period of time. If there are a couple of themes that sort of stood out for the judges as we consider this book, I think one is the question of authority. Who has the authority to speak about life, the universe, and everything? And another is the human significance of the conversation about science and religion, that even when people are talking about far distant things, the angle on them that's often most important is their implications for human beings and the perspective of human beings on them. But that's enough for me. I'm really just here to say how delighted we were to read this book and to be able to award it the one of the ISSR prizes for 2024. And now I'm going to hand over to John Hedley Brooke. And no one better, I think, to have a conversation with Nick Spencer about this book, as John Hedley Brooke is the author of what has undoubtedly been the most influential overview of the history of science and religion. So both of you have written excellent, comprehensive overviews of this history.
Thank you, Fraser, for that introduction. Since this book was awarded an ISSR prize, I think the first thing I should do is actually to congratulate Nick. It's a while now since the prize was awarded, but this is a book that he knows I have always admired in its formation and in its final appearance. Nick, the first time we spoke to each other, I think, or the first time I had another occasion to congratulate you, was when you published that little book, Darwin and God, which I see now was actually published in 2009. And that's probably your first and most important adventure in the science and religion terrain at that point. How do you see that book now? I mean, did that really pave the way for subsequent things you have done in this particular area?
Thank you, John. Well, firstly, say thank you very much for your kind words and those of Fraser as well. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about Magisteria. And you're right, Darwin and God, published, goodness me, 16 years ago now, is in a sense a microcosm and dry run for Magisteria, if I can put it that way. It's a much shorter book. It's 130 pages. It was published in 2009 because, as you will know very well, 2009 was a bit of a big Darwin year.
Mm.
200 years since its birth, 150 years since the publication of The Origin. But it was also right in the middle of the new atheist phenomenon. And for the new atheists, Darwin was the poster boy for atheism, because so much of the new atheists' logic and thinking in that period of time was predicated on how the world that had been revealed by natural selection effectively disproved, for all intents and purposes, they would say, any religious vision of the world. Now, that is a big issue, and there have been innumerable books examining that question. There were far fewer, almost no books, looking at what Darwin himself said and thought on this matter. And that's partly because, as you know, Darwin didn't say very much. He didn't trust himself to venture onto these territories. He didn't like getting theological, despite the fact he studied it at Cambridge. He didn't like getting philosophical towards the end of his life. He even doubted whether the human mind was capable of this kind of abstract adjudication. But he nonetheless had a fascinating spiritual journey, and one that was not easily boxable either into the religious apologists who liked to claim he had a deathbed conversion, or the atheist apologists who saw him as a trailblazer for their ideology. So it struck me he had an interesting and nuanced and very instructive spiritual biography, if I can put it that way, which was great fun to chart. And in a sense, that's what Magisteria is, just on a much bigger canvas.
That's really helpful, Nick. And we're not going to turn this conversation into a series of questions, but there was something else that mediated between that book and the appearance of Magisteria. And I'm thinking of that BBC radio series you did on the secret history of science and religion. And I think that title intrigued a lot of people. You know, what is this secrecy that's been kept from us all this time? But what was fascinating about that was that you were interviewing a lot of some of the leading figures in the field. And I guess those interviews found their way in various ways into insights that appeared in Magisteria. And I just wondered if you've got any reflections now on that BBC series, because for some of us, that was absolutely splendid. And you were introducing a much wider public to this sense of well, something that required a little bit of diligent unpicking to get to the real heart of the matter.
Mm.
And you were drawing on a range of expert opinion, which I think was invaluable.
Well, thank you. I mean, the first thing to say is that I'm rubbish with titles. And I doubt whether I've published a book which has had the title that I originally gave it, because publishers look at it and they think, that's a bit dull, or that's a bit bronze seal. We need something that's going to grab the reader, or in the radio case, the listener, a bit more powerfully. And actually, the title, The Secret History of Science and Religion, was imposed on the series almost at the last minute by sort of Radio 4 controllers, on the basis that if you call something The Secret History of Something, you're implying that it was going to reveal something that the general public didn't know, and therefore it would be a good title. Now, one can have one's opinion on that, but I guess the background, that the underlying point to that is that we know from research that the default position of the general public is that science and religion are in some kind of conflict. And there's certainly no widespread sense that science as we know it now owes anything to Christianity. But the work that you have done, and others, Peter Harrison, it also comes into mind here in the academy, for more than 40 years now, have been dismantling that simplistic warfare, conflict narrative metaphor. That hasn't filtered down, hadn't filtered down, and question mark whether it has not, hasn't yet filtered down to a wider public. So the purpose of the radio series, when I persuaded the BBC that it was worth doing, was that this was a different story, because most people assumed conflict, tension, war in a simplistic way. And really, we know from a lot of excellent work that's been done in the academy that isn't that. But with all due respect, people who listen to Radio 4 are much less likely to go and then buy a book by Cambridge University Press or whoever. So it was an attempt to kind of bridge that gap. It did feed into Magisteria, but it's worth saying we were very lucky. We had 3 30-minute episodes, which in radio terms isn't bad at all. But actually, it's remarkable how very, very little you cover, even in 90 minutes, particularly with a canvas this is as vast as this. So it kind of prepared the way for Magisteria, but in reality, it wasn't much more than a few toes in the water.
Oh, that's really interesting. Now, you said you know good with titles. Was Magisteria not your own title?
It wasn't. That wasn't my own title either. The sell for the publisher, whom we came to after the Radio 4 series, was want a book of the series. What's the argument of the book? The argument of the book is very similar to one of the series, which Fraser pointed out at the beginning, that we may come on to talk about. The relationship between science and religion has historically been very, very messy. We don't want to corral it into a single narrative. It just doesn't work like that. That's not historically accurate. But there are certain themes that keep on recurring, very different places, very different people, very different disciplines, time and time again. And the central one to my mind was the question of the human. What kind of being is the human? And then the attendant question, who has the right to say? And the argument in the series and the book is that when tensions between science and religion have flared up, and I'm very clear in both that they have flared up, this is no simplistic narrative of harmony, it tends to have been around that dual question of who are we, or what are we, and who gets to say. So the book was originally titled, I think it was entitled The Nature of the Beast, or I want to call it The Natures of the Beast, because plurality is very, very important to the story. And it's not a bad title, but they discovered that somebody else was publishing a book around the same time, completely different subject, but a similar title, which is a real death knell for publishers. You don't want 2 similar titled books. And then my editor said, rather tentatively, what do you think of Magisteria? And I said, wow, that's really, really good. I mean, I love it. So all down to them again.
Right. And of course, one reason why Magisteria is such a good title is that you are in the book taking on, to some degree, Stephen Jay Gould's famous NOMA principle, that there should be no overlapping magisteria. And your entanglement thesis is quite hard to reconcile with no overlapping magisteria, unless you can take an extreme position, I suppose, which is to say that any entanglement at any time was a bad thing, and mistakes were made all along the line, which only modern secular philosophy of biology can actually clarify and dispose of. But it seems to me Gould is an interesting figure in this context, because having written a little on him myself, and once hearing him speak in San Diego, where he spoke so fast and so loudly that everybody in the room felt at the end of an hour and 20 minutes of this extraordinary waterfall of sound that we'd just been blasted against the wall. And trying to remember what he'd actually said and that we could cling to afterwards was extremely difficult. A very colourful speaker. And curiously, I mean, in the context of the no overlapping magisteria methodological principle, really, which I suppose is what it is, it is remarkable that writing as a historian of science as he did in those many natural history magazine articles and then compiled into the various books he wrote. The thing that always struck me about those was that he was very, very open to the idea that social context, personal ideas were significant when you're trying, well, if you're trying to reconstitute a sophisticated history of science, you have to place thinkers in their contexts. And that's going to include the religious context, or it's going to include an anti-religious context in some cases. And I just wonder how you look at that thesis now, and having exposed some of the flaws of it in Magisteria, do you still have an ounce of sympathy for what he was trying to do, which was to create a default position which would eliminate some of the conflict?
Yeah, I do. I do. In fact, I have more. I have several ounces of sympathy. I mean, I'm a great fan of his writing. He's a beautiful, clear writer and vivacious. So I've never heard him speak. So interesting to hear you reflect on that. I would say that in as far as I have any particular intellectual discipline, it is history of ideas, and I've written far more on political and public theology than I have on science and religion, as it happens. But that was a very helpful context for me, because you don't write about political theology without writing about politics, if you see what I mean, without writing about the context. And there is a danger when writing about science and religion is to treat these as abstracted ideas floating above the surface of everyday life. That isn't really how they should be tackled. It's certainly not how I tackled them. It's not how Stephen Jay Gould tackled them. So I have a great deal of sympathy. The irony, maybe if that's too strong a word, is that one can apply that same logic to what he wrote and when he wrote it. So I think the Noma idea first came in an article, I think it was 97. And then the Rock of Ages book was published a year or two later. Now, this is before the new atheist phenomenon has kind of erupted proper, but it's well into a decade when Richard Dawkins and a few others are articulating with great force and great cogency their theory of science and religion being completely incompatible. And their effective premise for that is that science and religion are wholly overlapping magisteria, because religion was basically a prototypical attempt to explain the way the world worked. They were doing the same thing. Science came along, did it a lot better. That's kind of the underlying principle. So when Stephen Jay Gould comes along, he's, if I can put it this way, he's on the side of the angels there. He's saying, no, that's simply not true. If you understand religion, historically anachronistic term, but we'll let it ride for now, in its context in the past, they're not simply doing proto-science. There's something else going on there. Now, he then builds up this whole infrastructure of actually the thing that's going on there is totally different. Science deals with facts, religion deals with values, never the twain shall meet. They are non-overlapping magisteria. So it's almost as if, in attempting to prize apart these parties that have been set on one another by Dawkins, etc., in the ring, he ends up pulling them so far apart that he says they don't even belong in the same territory together. And that, I think, is simply not the case. But I have sympathy with what he was trying to do, not least because of the time he was trying to do it.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, it reminds me of that wonderful little aphorism of Terry Eagleton, to regard religion as failed science, or as you used the term, some kind of prototypical but failed science. It's like seeing the movements of a ballerina as a failed attempt to catch a bus, and that's always stuck in my mind.
Yes.
As a very cogent little comment. And I noticed, I was looking at John Gray's book, 7 Types of Atheism, And in the chapter where he is very critical of the Dawkins critique of religion, I think it's the first chapter of the book. I mean, he says something very, very similar, that the primary purpose of religion is not to explain the world, but it's to give meaning or to confer meaning on the world.
Mm.
And I'm very sympathetic, I have to say, to looking at things from that perspective.
I am, but here's where that view doesn't necessarily falls down, but maybe runs into the sand a bit. You use the interesting word confer there. Now, one would assume that the meaning that I draw from, maybe that's too strong, the meaning that I can sustain about the world isn't just me conferring onto it. It's not totally dissociated. It has something to do with what is, if you like. The meaning of the world has something to do with the nature of the world. And that's why I think Stephen Jay Gould's total separation is unsustainable, because you can't talk about meaning and value without having some idea of the kind of thing you are conferring or talking meaning and value about. That doesn't necessarily mean there is an absolutely iron deterministic connection between the two, but I rebel slightly against the idea that human beings are capable of conferring a complete set of meanings on the world without simultaneously attempting to understand, if you like, how the world functions.
I'm with you on that. What I was just then thinking about was what I would call the kind of subtitle. Well, it is the subtitle of your book, the entangled histories of science and religion. And this is a very powerful and evocative metaphor. The entangled histories of science and religion. Is it that the histories are entangled, or is it that science and religion have been entangled? Because I think there's a possible space there where one could go either way. And I suppose my concern about this is that if you say that we've got an entangled history of science and religion, it assumes that science and religion are already somehow predefined. And so you say, there's science, there's religion, there's entanglement. But if the thesis is really about the ways in which the theory and practice of science has at various points in the past been somehow interpenetrated by theological ideas. You know, the unity of the universe because it's the creation of one God. The theology gets infused into the science. And that means the meanings of the words science and religion are much more affected somehow by the entanglement. It's the old problem, isn't it? We don't like the terms science and religion for talking about these grand narratives, but the truth is one does need some kind of crutch to get into the discussion in the first place. And then people tell you, yes, but you know, these words didn't mean the same to medieval theologians as they did to the 17th century and to and of course I think each of us deep respect for Peter Harrison, who has argued that in so much depth.
Yes.
We'll come to the territories metaphor, I think, a bit later, because you, in your most recent book, are suggesting that even the territories metaphor might be transmuted into something else that might be more fitting.
Mm.
But the cheeky question is, are you now the author of an entanglement thesis? We've had a conflict thesis, we've had a harmony thesis, we've had a revisionist thesis, all these different theses we've had. I'm guilty of being the author of a complexity thesis, and my ears always kind of.
But if I can quote you back at you, I seem to recall reading you somewhere along the lines saying the complexity thesis isn't a thesis, it's just a statement of historical reality or something along those lines, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes,
So
absolutely.
so I would echo that with regards to entanglement. Entanglement isn't a thesis, it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor which is it's quite nice in that, you know, there's a chapter on physics in the early 20th century when the term entanglement kind of bubbles to the surface. So there's a nice little echo there. It's deliberately chosen. One of the things I really wanted to, and I think I was responsible for the word entanglement, unlike most of the other words in the title,
Mm.
was that it's not a very morally loaded term. You know, you know what warfare is, you know what conflict is, you know what harmony
Mm.
is, you know what they describe, but you know what kind of moral aura they carry with them. You can have good forms of entanglement and bad forms of entanglement. So, like, to pick up what you said, it's more of a statement of fact rather than a sustained thesis. And actually, it's more an attempt to reach for a vivid metaphor that is helpfully descriptive without being overly deterministic. I like the fact the Fraser in his introduction referred to the famous, I can never remember their authors, the guys who wrote 1066 and all that. There's a,
Sellers and Yeat.
that's right.
Was that it? Yeah.
Yes, that's right. There's a chapter in the book called 1543 and all that,
Mm.
which plays on the fact that histories of science, like sort of John Gribbins and others, 1543, Vesalius and Copernicus, this is the time when modern science developed. And you know, anyone who reads science thinks that really isn't. So it's so easy, not least if you're trying to catch the public's attention, to draw on dates or metaphors or images that unduly simplify and morally load what you're trying to say. An entanglement is an attempt not to make a thesis, but to just to try and grip the reader without unduly determining what they have to think about the subject.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to that because, of course, I have faced the problem that people want to either impugn a complexity thesis or regard it as just utterly trivial. Whereas what I think it is doing, and the entanglement thesis as well, it's opening the eyes of other researchers to the fact that they should not come with a closed mind to what it is that they're actually
Mm,
examining. And that's been, I think, a major problem in the historiography of science and religion, that too many minds have been made up before the history has actually been
mm,
examined and
mm,
examined. And one of the things I like most about your book is the fact that it has that open mindedness and then the encouragement of people just to see how extraordinary some of these stories
mm.
really are.
And also that there were throughout history moments in which science, religion, again, you'll forgive the historical anachronism of the term, but religion served as a supporter, a catalyst for, a protector for modern science, and as an inhibitor. And we mentioned Darwin earlier. I read when I was writing the Darwin book, most his correspondence was coming online. It was incredible. The Darwin
Mm.
Correspondence Project, brilliantly done and such a valuable resource. And there is, I think, an inclination, a bit of a rush amongst some kind of Christian apologists to say, well, actually, the Christian world accepted Darwinism remarkably quickly. Well, I mean, in one sense, it did. It didn't kind of run and run for decades and decades and decades, as some of the polemicists on the other side say. But there's a lovely letter from Darwin. I can't remember who it's to, written certainly in the 1860s, I think, in which he says something like, I would like to forward you or quote to you a letter I've received recently from a clergyman who calls me, who after voicing his contempt for me and all Darwinists in terms that he certainly wouldn't use from the pulpit, etc., etc. I can't remember the full
Yeah.
details, but it's a reminder that, you know, Charles Kingsley might have written a supportive letter for the theory before the book was even published, but there were clergy taking chunks out of Darwin years and decades afterwards.
Yeah. And I think there has always been the deep concern here. This hinges on the thesis about how the assessment, the identification, characterization of what it is to be human is often underlying these discussions. And the reason I'm just bringing that up again here is that I think Ron Numbers was very concerned that a lot of people were saying we have these schemes of reconciliation between Christianity and Darwinism, or perhaps just the fact of evolution, or the ethic of evolution, or whatever ever we call it. And the concern was that very few of the Christian apologists who appear to be open-minded on the Darwinian thesis nevertheless stopped short when it came to subsuming humans under the evolutionary story. You know, it was fine as long as you were talking about chimpanzees, right? As long as you were still talking about other animals. But when it came to the, as it were, the evolution of the soul, you were in a different kind of theological sphere where that kind of skeptical frame of mind would come to the fore.
I think that's exactly right. And that allows me to say, in a sense, why I think this concept of the human is so important. Because you could say, well, hang on, you can accept the evolution of everything up to, quote unquote, the chimpanzee, but not the human. Well, what's your problem there? And the problem, I think, is this, that nobody honest who has participated in this debate had said, no, that's strictly not true. I think we can reflect on the fact that science, properly understood, does not have the capacity to adjudicate on the existence or non-existence of God. Paley et al. Would have fundamentally disagreed with that, but I don't think we would. But what science can do is adjudicate on the status of the creature that is undeniably central to the Christian salvation story, the human creature. The creature that, according to Christian theology, God himself became incarnated as in order to save. The creature that is fallen, the creature that has, as we would say, it's the inalienable dignity, so on and so forth. Now, that seems to me to be the foundation stone for the Christian religious participation in this debate. And sensitive and intelligent and reflective Christian participants in this debate have said, yes, it's absolutely fine to understand human beings in mechanical terms, if you like, or in evolutionary terms, or in genetic terms, or even in information terms, or even if in the early 20th century in Freudian terms. But if that understanding of the human is an exclusive understanding of the human, we've got a problem. So if you think that humans are only machines, apropos La Mettrie in the middle of the 18th century, or only evolved primates, or only bundles of subconscious urges, or only genetically powered meat robots, then that human isn't the kind of human, isn't the kind of creature that is legitimately envisaged in the salvation story. And that's where we've got attention. And interestingly, this is a story that goes way, way back into the ancient world when astrology was obviously considered the science, but you had some of the church fathers railing against it because it seemed to ascribe or remove true moral agency from human beings, because if they were born under a certain star,
Mm.
they didn't have choice over their destiny. And humans being free moral agents was essential to that Christian anthropology. So there was a tension there. I think that's why the nature of the human becomes such an important battleground in this whole history.
No, and it's great. I think it's worth emphasizing that you do give considerable attention, particularly in the concluding chapters where we get into the 20th and the 21st centuries, that when you're dealing with issues like AI or transhumanism or something of that kind, it is really obvious then that the question what it is to be human is taking that central role. I suppose there may be those who possibly see a tendency to a kind of reductivism there. If you say that in almost every controversy there has been about science and religion, it is the human being who is the focus, because that could just become a little bit too reductionist in its own way.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. In fact, you may even have said that to me at one point in our discussions, and you're absolutely right that just as I didn't want to replace a simplistic narrative of conflict with a simplistic narrative of harmony, nor did I want to replace a complex, multifaceted history with the idea that actually it's all about this. I think the metaphor I use, maybe in the introduction, is that this concept of the human runs through this book like a river might do through a landscape. And a great deal of the landscape can be understood as having, as it were, been shaped or sculpted or oriented to the nature of this river. But you can't explain everything that's in the landscape just according to the presence of this river. It's important. It may even be the kind of the most significant feature, but it is not the landscape itself.
Well, I can't possibly contest that perfectly articulated answer, I think. I do just need to return for a moment to our discussion about entanglement earlier, because one of your very early reviewers, who was very sympathetic, I have to say, and didn't even like the fact that the word myth busting was being used as a characterization of your book, and said you had actually done a terrific demolition job. Myth busting sounds altogether too facile. This same commentator did suggest at the end that Magisteria is a plea for religion to remain entangled in our lives and in our science. And he was not convinced by that. Well, does religion have to remain entangled in our science? It's or perhaps you might want to say that's not actually quite an accurate rendition of the book.
I think another review you're talking about. I think yes, I know the one you mean. So the first thing I would say is actually I don't think, or at least I hope it's not. I hope the book isn't a plea in that regard. I can see why it might be read as such, but I certainly wasn't intentionally making one. But that doesn't head off the very interesting question whether you ask, should religion be entangled in science? I think one can answer this in two ways. Superficially, absolutely not. I mean, transparently not. There are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of quite brilliant, perceptive, thoroughly professional scientists in the world at the moment who haven't got a religious bone in their body and have no interest, and etc. So that's a statement of the bleeding obvious, if you like. I guess that the slightly more subtle response is that science is done by scientists. There's a very good book by Naomi Oreskes, who's a philosopher of science based in the US, called Why Trust Science. It's based on her series of lectures she gave out there. And she makes a very important point in these lectures that the common sort of response that is deployed when people say, why trust science, is, well, the good thing about science is it's self-correcting. Yes, it does make mistakes, but it self-corrects. And she makes a very good point. No, science does not self-correct. Scientists self-correct.
Sure.
And she makes a very cogent, perhaps the most cogent case I've ever heard for diversity in science, which can be a bit of a kind of a shallow window dressing kind of thing. But the point she makes with good historical examples is that historically, particularly when you're graduating to, as it were, more human sciences away from sort of physics, chemistry, say, an unduly homogenous group of scientists is less likely to spot their errors and correct one another than a slightly more diverse group of scientists. And she gives one or two hilarious examples of how that's happened. Now, in as far as a diverse group of scientists is naturally going to include some of whom who are religious, or perhaps just sympathetic to religious, I think it does maintain an important role there. But as part of that necessary diversity of views, backgrounds, cultures, that is part of the engine that helps science be self-correcting. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, I think. It it reminds me actually, as you were speaking, of some of the science that I studied most thoroughly in my early life when I was a chemistry student. And it's the science of 19th century French organic chemistry. Now, that was pretty technical stuff, but what I discovered was that the kind of classification which Thomas Kuhn tried to impose on the historiography of science, that we have long periods of normal science when there are clearly established paradigms, and then you get a crisis, and the crises build up until finally you have to discard the original paradigm and replace it with something that's new. I realized when I found myself studying that particular very small portion of the history of science, but just the history of organic chemistry when it was becoming a kind of new feature of chemistry. There was never any normal science in Kuhn's sense of an agreed paradigm, because these French organic chemists were at each other's throats all the time. They were daggers drawn against the German chemists. It was an immensely complicated story. But out of that extraordinary diversity, you do eventually get important features of the scientific landscape that you can say are consensual. You do eventually gravitate towards some kind of consensus. But any attempt to try to put too constrained a pattern on how that happens seems pretty destined to failure.
Yes.
And so, you know, even tiny episodes in the history of science can be illuminating, I think, in that respect. Yes. You have a very interesting page in Magisteria 408. I was just glancing down because
it's very specific.
well, yes, and I think I mean I'm totally in sympathy with this. So I'm not quoting it because I want to criticize it, but I think it's interesting because it kind of sums up what you've already been saying, and saying so well. This is the passage. Humans are both material creatures, which are measurable and explicable according to the methods of science, and spiritual ones who talk about and aspire to things like meaning, significance, transcendence, purpose, destiny, and love, which have always been the building blocks of religious understanding of reality. Science and religion are partially overlapping magisteria, and they overlap within us. Does that mean that this is reverting in a sense to what we were talking about earlier, but does that mean that Gould was really on a hiding to nothing, that he would have great difficulty in sustaining a Noma thesis? Because science and religion, you say, are partially overlapping magisteria. And that can sound a little bit like some kind of essentialism that has crept in through the back door.
Yes. So you're right that if I come to any conclusion as such, it's a POMA conclusion, partially overlapping magisteria, rather than NOMA. I take the point about essentialism, but this is, if you like, one of those moments in the book, such as the title as well. This is coming towards the end, where, in a sense, much of the rest of the book deals with qualifications, and a lot of it deals with the point that Peter picks up so brilliantly in Territories of Science and Religion, that it doesn't really make sense to talk about science and religion before certain times, and these aren't really essential categories. But moving to a conclusion, picking up what you said earlier, all of that noted, if we're talking about these categories, and we're not, in that classic academic sense, going to qualify and refine what we mean by them, how can we say they do relate to one another? And I plump for POMA, as if you like, for a simple arrangement, because I think that Gould is fundamentally wrong. And you can't distinguish, can't pull apart facts and values with the ease and simplicity with which he does. And you absolutely can't do that when you're talking about creatures like ourselves that are, I think Charles Taylor's phrase is self-interpreting. You know, we don't exist in any uninterpreted objective sense. You can't understand a human being like that. That little section comes at the end of, I think, of a section on neuroscience, and picking up the debates that are quite lively at the moment about how, you know, if you're familiar with these stories, if you put, you know, meditating monks or praying nuns into an MRI scanner, you find out this part of their brain lights up, and that suggests that, you know, God resides in the frontal lobe, and you kind of want to face plant there, and you think, you know, as a friend of mine says, a bit of your brain lights up when you eat a cheese sandwich. It doesn't mean you're not eating a cheese sandwich. And that's going back to my point about unduly restrictive and exclusive descriptions of the human. If you feel that your only legitimate description of the human is blood flow, for example, or what you get from an MRI scan, or genetics, or whatever it might be, you're going to have an inadequate and an insufficient description, because you are not encompassing the human, understanding the human at all the different levels that the human can exist. And for the sake of simplicity, I've talked about in that sentence humans existing at a material level and at a spiritual level. I put spiritual in inverted commas because there's lots of different ways of interpreting that. But it is not just describing humans in terms of molecules or genes or blood flow or whatever else. It does not mean you cannot also describe them in terms of aspirations, will, desire, so on and so forth.
Right. I think that's a very helpful assessment, and I'm rather drawn to POMA. I don't think I have myself ever quoted you on that. Perhaps I should have. I've not given you a chance, really, in our conversation to emphasize just the extraordinary scope of Magisteria. You have the blessing of an accolade from Peter Harrison, who's been tacitly referred to a time or two. This is easily the most comprehensive and accessible history of these two magisteria presently available. That's a great accolade from somebody who I think we both respect very, very highly. But it just made me think that we've got to try to give those who are watching this or listening a sense of just what you did cover in the book, because we go all the way from ancient philosophy through medieval theology, through science and Islam. We go through the Copernican debates, the Galileo affair, Enlightenment philosophy, theology, Enlightenment science, right through to evolution, Darwin, all this. In other words, everything you might hope to find in a book on the history of science and religion is there. But there is a question which comes from this, and that is, how do we choose which episodes we are going to talk about when we are writing as a historian? Because in what you've been writing more recently, and I'm thinking of the book with Hannah Wade, you say that we somehow all got science and religion wrong, and we've chosen to talk about the things that are wrong. And you mention in that context things like evolution, quantum mechanics, perhaps anthropology particularly. So we always go for the same topics, but because of that, we've got it wrong. Now, we are those who have, in a sense, dictated in certain respects what the topics are, because people who've read what I've written and what you have written, if they haven't read it yet, they should, that they, I think, are going to look to the historian to select the things which really are fundamental. So can you say a little bit more about what I see as a slight tension between what you've done as a historian in Magisteria and what you've done with Hannah with the surveys and the attempt to get beyond an elite and to get to how the public actually see these issues?
Yeah, so I would say that I wouldn't phrase how the book Playing God, I think you're referring to, which is a kind of almost like a follow-on from Magisteria. I wouldn't say, and I certainly wouldn't claim that, as it were, we've got it wrong with science and religion, and I certainly wouldn't claim that our familiar subjects, the endless books on cosmology or evolution, are themselves unimportant or irrelevant, or let alone wrong. They're not. They're very important. Many of them are very, very interesting. I guess the point we make there is that, and we do talk about these subjects an awful lot for various reasons. But if the theory behind Magisteria is right, and actually I used the word theory there, perhaps I shouldn't have done, if the kind of one of the underlying ideas, this river in the landscape behind Magisteria is right, and the question of the human is so important, actually there are a whole range of other subjects that don't usually get so much coverage in the science and religion press that are in and of themselves interesting, and I think this is the killer point, are going to become not only interesting but urgent in the 21st century. What I mean by that is that science's ability, I'll reify it for now, science's ability to understand, manipulate, control, and quote unquote improve the human is unprecedented today. And Playing God, the book that followed on from Magisteria, looks at, for example, genetic engineering, obviously. Less obviously, the huge amount of money that's being poured into radical life extension at the moment.
Mm.
The interesting legal cases there are, particularly in the US, about whether non-human animals should be recognized as persons. The, the question that doesn't ever leave the headlines at the moment in terms of what is the status or the coming status of AI. The fascinating question that Andrew Davison's written so very well about, what would the discovery of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe mean for us? Now, these are all very live, and some of them urgently live,
Mm.
scientific issues that, as it were, are fully on religion's lawn, if I can put it that way.
Oh, yes.
So I think there are really profitable conversations to be had there.
Well, these are really exciting topics, aren't they?
They are.
And they are so topical. I think, having just glanced at how long we've been having this conversation, I can't believe we've been talking for so long. But I would like just to hear from you a bit more about the metaphor that you have wanted to superimpose upon this debate, partly in the light of the interviews and the surveys you've been conducting. Why are landscapes better than territories?
That's a provocative way of putting it. So the book you're referring to is the most recent one that's come out, which is called The Landscapes of Science and Religion, subtitles What Are We Disagreeing About, which is based on a big research project that you mentioned. I would emphatically say, first of all, that I don't think landscapes is a better metaphor than territories. In fact, I hesitated to use the metaphor of landscapes because I admire Peter's book so much. I consider myself to be perching on the shoulders of giants there, as they say. Briefly, the point there is that Peter's book is historical. It ends in the 19th century when the modern practices, phenomena, whatever you want to call them, of what we now refer to as science, what we now refer to as religion, are more or less settled. And I see what he means by that, and I partially agree with him. But actually, the way we talk about science and religion is still radically diffuse and different and contradictory today. And if you want to understand this basic question of how do you think science and religion relate to one another, you've first of all got to understand, what do you mean by science? How are you using the word science, and what do you mean by religion? Now that then opens up a whole philosophical can of worms about the use of language and so on and so forth. So this is a bit more of an academic book that draws on a lot of Wittgenstein's philosophy. But we settle on the landscape metaphor partly as in homage to Peter's territories,
Yes.
but also because a landscape, if you like, is a territory seen from eye level. Territories are kind of what you see on maps. Landscapes are what you see when you're immersed there. And because it's much more of a book of some philosophy, more sociology of science and religion, that's the metaphor we chose. In a landscape, you don't see clear divisions. You don't see, as it were, territorial boundaries, as you might say on a map. In a landscape, all you can do is identify features, and the idea, the metaphor of features, plays quite a significant role in that book. So I'm definitely not supplanting Peter then. Let's say I'm just adding to him.
Sure. Well, that enables us to end perhaps on a very harmonious note. I think I would also then like to take advantage of this moment to say we ought all to be reading the massive new book that Peter himself produced very recently, and Some New Worlds is just an astonishing work of scholarship. And in a sense, it's something that everybody ought to read before they ever dare pronounce on the relationship between science and religion again. So, I mean, I also bend the knee before Peter, having seen the outcome of his research, and emphasizing you've got to get to the meaning of the words. And historians, I think, are trying to do that more than perhaps they once did. But it's very much, I think, in pursuit of the kind of whole framework of ideas that he is suggesting we need to bear in mind. The problem is, to do it well, you have to be a historian, a philosopher, a scientist, a theologian, and a biblical scholar.
And there aren't many that tick all those boxes.
There aren't many of those. And one other growth area, of course, in the historiography and in general discourse about science and religion, is the globalization.
Yes.
Because you would say, I think, that your book is well, to say it's restricted to a kind of European and American focus is unkind, because it goes further than that. But when I wrote mine and you've written yours, progress in terms of globalizing the discourse of science and religion was still in a very primitive state. And a lot has been happening in the last 10 years or so to extend that. So maybe that's another book.
Another one in 20 years' time, I think, yes.
Nick, it's been great to have this conversation. We must have another one, perhaps not on YouTube next time.
Yes.
But anyway, it's been great to see you. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, John. It's been a pleasure.